Well, look at us. We're all from the United States. It seems mostly from New York and all this stuff. But if you look at us, we do seem to have some differences in our phenotypes, our human variation, which leads us to the big question of this chapter. The key issue, the thing that we most want to know about. For one thing, the chapter begins or tells us at various points by the middle that we are, as human beings, very similar genetically, very genetically similar. We are, all the human beings on this earth, all of us today, are one interbreeding species. And in fact, we've been one interbreeding species for, at least 100,000 years, maybe more. What do we mean by that? That means if you get together people from different parts of New York and different parts of Long Island and different parts of Hong Kong and Long Island, that if they are of reproductive age and reproductively capable, they will be able to get together and have viable offspring who can also reproduce. And as different as we may look in different parts of the world, short and tall and dark and light, though we are still one interbreeding species. In fact, we're extremely similar, genetically speaking. We are one of the most similar species. You look at other species like penguins, for example, who we would say all look alike, they actually have much greater degrees of genetic difference between their individuals than we do. So we're a recent and a very similar genetic species, genetically speaking. We also have a penchant for, as our textbook tells us, we do this a lot, we migrate and we intermingle. So although many of you are from New York or different parts of the country, we go to different places and we intermingle with the people there. We test out the interbreeding species concept with each other quite a bit in human life. So we get around, so to speak. But it then leads to the question is, if we are so genetically similar, why do we appear to be so physically different? And when it says people from different regions, it's speaking about different regions, people that are from different regions of the world. So we just did where we're from right now, but probably a 10 or 12 generations ago, or 5 or 6 generations ago, some of your ancestors were from different parts of the world, and we look at each other and we say, wait a second, we are pretty physically different from each other. How can that be if we are 99.9% the same genetically speaking and form one interbreeding species? There are other species in the world that look more similar to each other than human beings, but are genetically more distinct. So that will be our key issue. The answer to this question, I just want to forward to you early on. We'll be exploring this more in the next chapter, but they have it here in your textbook on page 51, but they hid it in a little box off to the side. This is actually the hidden answer, which we'll be, again, exploring more in the next class when we finish the chapter, is that relatively recent evolutionary adaptations to new and localized environmental challenges have altered our visible phenotypes. So we're genetically very the same, but we have adapted relatively recently to different environments which change the way we look, even if it hasn't modified substantially our genetic code. Now, just to, again, to fast forward the answer, when we say relatively recent evolutionary adaptations, we're talking about things that have happened in the last thousands of years. hundreds of thousands of years, not millions of years. These are not evolutionarily deep changes. We have not dramatically altered our genetic code to make us different from each other. But to understand this, we actually then need to go into these things that some of you confess that you hate, biology, and talk about the difference between genotype and phenotype. This is biology, but we're mostly going to concentrate on how it applies to human beings, and we're not going to get way, way deep into it. You can do that on your own for those of you who are biology majors. We're just going to get into it enough and then figure out the big points of it. So the genotype refers to the genetic makeup of someone. That's all those little letters that we use like C, G, A, T, and we mix them all up. That's the DNA. That's your genetic code, you might say, of any organism. But the phenotype is the physical traits that we see. Maybe we don't see, but we know they're there, like lactose tolerance, for example. Now, some of these are an expression of the genotype. So some of the physical traits that we see just come about because we have different genetics, different genetic codes, and that codes for certain characteristics. And then you get the organism. But the phenotype is also influenced by the environment in which you grow up in. And the environment which you grow up in will cause to turn on or off different genes. And it works in a particularly complicated way in human beings. Human beings are genetically similar, but we can make physical changes without necessarily hugely altering our genetic code. And we are especially prone to what they call phenotypic variability without necessarily, as I've been saying, needing to do huge genetic shifts. So if you take two people and raise them in radically different environments, put one person on the tropics and the coast and put one person in the high altitude mountains, they may be genetically even the same, identical twins, but if you raise them in very different environments and feed them very different food, they will actually end up looking quite different people. And this applies to the immediate environment in which we are raised and the food we eat and our adaptations to things as we grow up. But it also applies to over time in the sense of hundreds or thousands of years. If people spend different generations in a particular environment, they develop adaptations to that environment, which are not necessarily, they're not written into the genetic code in other ways. I should say here also that the genotype is always changing without necessarily influencing our phenotype. So the genetic code is also changing as well. Now, your textbook goes into a classic example of something that you may have seen in a biology class at some point. Some people get excited about this. Some people are having a horrific reaction to this. The famous Punnett square. And in this case, they started talking to us about dimples. Dimples seem to be a dominant trait in the Punnett square. If one of your parents has dimples, you're probably going to have them. And that's what we're led to believe. Why do we have dimples? Huh? Dimples, the mutation of dimples. Yeah, I don't know. Are they a mutation? Blue something. So most people were brown-eyed and then some mutation happened and some blue-eyed people came along. Got to get rid of those people. Yeah. Why did this happen though? What is the advantage to having dimples? Yes, you should be looking at me like I'm crazy. There's no advantage to having dimples. Some people like them, some people don't. Blue eyes. What's the advantage to having blue eyes? Some people like them, some people don't. The thing is there's a lot of things in genetics and in human evolution that you're going to want to know why, because we're taught that evolution is supposed to be on this pathway to getting better and better and better. It's not. It's a lot of random stuff, and there's not necessarily an explanation for it. It just happened. And somehow the dimples got in there, and then we can't get rid of them. There they are, dimples. And so we do these Punnett squares. Yeah, this is the Mendelian genetics. The idea that the traits are coded for with dominant and recessive. And remember, he was growing those pea plants. Of course, he didn't know that he was doing genetics, but he was doing the tall and the short and the flowers and all those things. And so ever since then, we've had to do these Punnett squares and learn about dominant and recessive, but rarely do we learn why it matters that there might be a dominant gene and a recessive gene, and that they mix around like this. Why should we learn this stuff? Why does it matter that this is the way inheritance is passed on? Let me put it to you this way. Before Mendel's time, it was assumed that yes, children look like their parents, but it was assumed that it was like blending two colors of paint together. So let's say you had red paint and white paint, and you blended them together, you'd get pink paint. It was kind of like their parents, but kind of different. Why does it matter that it doesn't work exactly that way? You can have this dominant and recessive thing. Those things then might come out differently in, say, the third or fourth cross down the line. So it skips a generation, so you don't see it, but it's still there. And so it's not like the paint, right? If it was just all blended together, it would be different. And so the reason this is important to us is that when we inherit things, we inherit discrete genes. It's not just all blended together, which gives us the possibility that those recessive genes can preserve variation down the line. And that variation is the stuff that evolution is based upon. If there weren't variation, then we'd all start looking the same like cans of paint, and then there'd be nothing for evolution to work on. And so that's one reason for this is important. The other reason is that it means that our traits can combine and recombine independently. They are not fixed to each other. So stuff like hair color and nose shape and dimples, lips, all those things, they don't come as a package. They come as this complex combination and recombination of these individual traits. So if you have parents who have quite different skin tones or hair colors, for example, you get different combinations of those traits. This attribute of evolution is actually referred to as the modern synthesis, or sometimes referred to as neo-Darwinian evolution. And what it does is combine the ideas that Darwin had in terms of the selection process with the ideas that Mendel had of inheritance. Darwin and Mendel were basically contemporaries and that they lived around the same time, but they never knew each other. They never exchanged papers or anything like that. And Darwin really didn't understand the principles of inheritance. They thought of this as a blended paint scenario. Mendel was working on inheritance, but really wasn't thinking about selection and evolution. And it was only after both of them died in, say, the 1930s, 40s, and 50s that people put their work together to give us what most of us learn in biology as the modern evolutionary synthesis. And so that's why we learn about the things like the Punnett squares and inheritance, because it tells us about those mechanisms of evolution and how traits can skip generations and still show up and be part of the genetic pool. It's important, though, to know that as far as human beings go, as your textbook says, many traits are determined by a much more complex process than a single gene with only two alleles. So this may work for sometimes for pea plants and different organisms, but in human beings, there are extremely few traits that simply correspond to the dominant and recessive model. For the most part, or most of our phenotypes are complexly determined. So most of our phenotypes are what they call polygenic. They are influenced by many different genes, or they call them multifactorial, which means that it's not just going to be one gene for one trait. Again, especially in human beings, most of the visible traits that we see are influenced by a whole bunch of different processes. Now, one of the curious things about human beings is we go through a pretty complex process when we do sexual reproduction, or our gametes are formed, this process of meiosis. It takes the parent genes and produces four different, well, let me put it this way. Every single gamete is a completely different genetic variation, a completely unique genetic variation. And there is another thing that happens here during the meiosis process. We're usually taught, I think most of us are taught about how it's like shuffling a deck of cards, where you have some cards from your mother and some cards from your father, and which ones you get will be random. But there's a new twist that they give you to this. It's pretty crazy, actually. So yes, we've heard about it's a random combination, but as that is happening, they can somehow, sometimes, and this is apparently a pretty common process, we just don't know about it, that some of the male or the female chromosomes end up on each other. And so before that initial shuffling of the deck, they've already done some swapping around. This is called crossing over. It made me think of these genes. They had the male and female, but then they're swapping around and some genes are crossing over. Sounds pretty crazy. It is. There's a pretty good diagram for it on page 56, where they show you how the meiosis process works, basically. But you can also look at, if you type into YouTube and look for some videos on gametes and crossing over in the meiosis process, it diagrams how this works. The point of it for us is that human genetic codes and human reproduction is extremely complicated, and even things like dimples are not even as simple as maybe sometimes your textbook describes. And so again, I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole on are dimples actually a dominant trait in human beings? And I did this because when I was growing up, I was taught that all kinds of things were dominant and recessive that actually aren't. We've learned a lot since then. So when I was growing up, I was taught that brown eyes were dominant and blue eyes were recessive. But now we know that eye color is influenced by multiple genes. And so a lot of the stuff that we were taught in school in the old days about dominant and recessive as it applies to human beings is much more complicated than you thought, and maybe even more than your textbook outline. So dimples are supposed to be dominant, but in fact, and so there are some people who have dimples their whole life, and some people change over time. Some people might have them as a kid and then not have them as an adult, or you might develop them later on. And so they're actually not a dominant trait. They're called an irregular dominant trait. So they're most of the time they're dominant, but not necessarily. So again, this is just to say that when it comes to human variation, we do vary physically quite a bit from each other. And we'll be learning, especially in the next part of the chapter, how much we do physically vary in ways that many of us perhaps haven't even thought about. But the reasons for that are complicated, and they're not necessarily because we're so hugely genetically different from each other. They're probably more based on our phenotypic or our physical variations, which is a recent and environmentally specific adaptations that we've had. All right, that's complicated enough for now.